the dopamine tunnel junction. Now, in the last couple of months and years, I have been thinking about how can I model for myself basically the different pathways that are decisions in my life, and incorporating already into the model basically what I seem to now what I seem to have listened to, and also other sources of information, and try to incorporate this into a model. And the result of this has been the dopamine tunnel junction. Now, what this offers is a couple of things, and so I now want to describe what the dopamine tunnel junction is. Decisions can be modeled out in a three-dimensional space or in a two-dimensional space, of course also maybe in other dimensional spaces. So usually, if you have a joint junction diagram, it looks like this. You have the joint, and then you have, this is the junction, I think, and so you have these pathways that go up and down. One could already simplify this and say, okay, if there is a version of me that makes a decision, let's just try to say, okay, if I now go to McDonald's or I instead eat a healthy alternative, then one could say that one version is better off, at least maybe retrospectively. One could judge this, because maybe at McDonald's I will meet the person that will change my life, but maybe also I won't. So it's always a little bit risky to try to predict the future. But nonetheless, if one retrospectively could take a look at someone's life and say, okay, this decision led to this and this decision led to this, then one could model out all of these decisions, and let's just again simplify to basically bimodal decisions, which would basically be decisions between two different options. Then one could say one is basically improving this person's life, and one is basically decreasing one is not improving, I don't know what the corresponding word for this would be, this person's life. And so if I think about many decisions about my life, I can sometimes say, for example, if I yesterday would not have chosen to train, then I would now be worse off. Because now, for example, I would have to train in the next 66 minutes in order to still be able to have trained during this date. And this would be something that I now would regret already doing, so basically not doing in the earlier part of the day, or yesterday. Now, if I therefore can model this in 2 dimensions, why not also model it in 3 dimensions? And the 3-dimensional space has a big upside, and this is that also the 3-dimensional space is used for many other analogies as well. If we think about something to overcome, then this is something to overcome. So there is maybe a tree in your path, and the path can go up, it also can go down. So it offers basically already 3 different variables. And so if you think, for example, about a mountaintop, then the top is the goal, and then you can go up. But now if you think about moving forward in time, but also in this case in space, and you want to reach a certain goal, sometimes you actually have to go down, because the path actually leads down. So the vector of u, with the vector kind of representing the current method of optimization towards this overarching goal, which would be at the mountaintop, can go down, but eventually it now has to go down, because the path right next to you, there is no path. Right left to you, there is also no path. So you have to follow this vector now down maybe into a tunnel, because that's the only way up to the peak. So this also already implies this thing that sometimes you need to go down and actually in order to actually go up. And now the tunnel junction has kind of a different feeling to it, because not a different feeling, but has, I think, additional things. Now, here it is not as clear what the overarching goal is. That's kind of a problem. But because we now go under the surface, we now can basically act in 3 dimensions actually, and not just on the outer layer of a mountaintop. Because on the outer layer of a mountaintop, you always have to stay on this thin area, which is basically not air, but also not mountain. And so there can only be certain paths up, but in the tunnel now, it's different, because we can have tunnels which point into all directions. Because they point into all directions, and because it also usually takes effort to take steps, it takes also less effort to take steps down. It takes more effort to take steps up, which now means that these vectors could be kind of our models for the dopamine moving forward. So if we follow the things that come easy to us, we're basically going down. So we would have in the 3-dimensional plane, that is now the tunnel, let's just say there's a tunnel around me, and I now have different options laid out in front of me. If I now would open up TikTok, then this path would lead down. Now, first of all, I have to mention now that the downward movement is now not already associated with the downward, basically with the decrease in improvement. So if we again move to this 2-dimensional model of bimodal bimodal decisions, then this would not necessarily be implemented also in the three-dimensional model, because here it is different. Here now we assume just, okay, there are different paths and we can now choose these different paths. And now the harder it is for us to do a certain thing, so the less dopamine there might be involved in the short term in this. So now maybe for the time interval, I usually refer to short, mid and long term, and I will probably also use this distinction within this video. So if I now have an option in front of me that could be eating a cheeseburger, or that could be eating something that is healthier, then at a certain satiety level, I can eat the cheeseburger more readily. So I can already eat the cheeseburger if I'm, let's say, an hour earlier into my hunger, and I have to basically wait longer, so I have to fast longer for me to not have to eat the cheeseburger, because the cheeseburger basically is able to be eaten at a higher satiety level. At least that's kind of how I think about this, compared to maybe a healthier alternative that comes with less sugar, so therefore it's kind of less optimized or less using, not necessarily less optimized, but less abusing the construction of the mind that is kind of, or that kind of has made up these rules over the course of evolution, which is opt for fat and sugary things, because then you can get in many calories in a quite dense way. Now, back to the tunnel. If I now have multiple options in front of me, the first one could be doing something that I don't really want to do, then there might be less dopamine involved. So I actually would have to move upwards. And for moving upwards, I also would have to expend the physical energy, because moving upwards takes more energy, because I'm kind of counteracting gravity to a certain extent. If I now would have an option that would be neutral, I basically would move to the side. So this would be a tunnel that actually just goes to the side. And if I have an option that actually gives back energy to a certain extent as walking, so basically there is an additional force that gives me energy, in this case it would be gravity, but this additional energy could also be simplifying rules, for example. It could be instead of trying to study now, I just open up TikTok, I just open up Instagram, I just open up YouTube, and there are external things that make it easier for me to stay within this tunnel. In this tunnel, now also in 3D space, within our joint tunnel junction. Therefore, the different options I have cannot only be two, but they can be multiple ones. They can also be viewed already as multiple ones, because there is basically an infinite space of vectors that can go basically towards me. So these options would also point into all of these different directions. So if I point in this direction, there might be Alpha Centauri basically in a couple of 1,000 light years, or I don't know how many light years it is until Alpha Centauri. But because the three dimensions basically point to the rest of space, and I recently heard something where there would be maybe that maybe our universe is kind of embedded within a black hole, which was a very intriguing idea. Or maybe not intriguing, but at least interesting idea. So by pointing into a certain direction, we basically already, by using 3D space, we have an almost infinite degree of directions. Now, you could also argue this is already true in the two-dimensional space, but in terms of getting this into an analogy, I think this makes more sense, that there would be so many different options available. So we have these different options available. Simplified, they can go up, so they can have an increased effort, they can go neutral, and they can also go down. Now, of course, this model again could also be used for the two-dimensional model, which would be just a sheet of paper, in which we also can go up, down, but then again we would have multiple options as in the multiple different ways. And so now, in terms of choice architecture, how this now comes in is, I think one needs to basically try to lift up. So now this would be a vector that points downwards, also a tunnel that points downwards. If I just assume now the tunnel actually has a straight line, one would basically try with choice architecture to move down the, now different, it's actually I thought different. So the things that usually would take effort per step, so there is also a certain marginal effort per step involved. So the step would be the unit we would take a look at. So per step, we would try to move the things that we actually in the mid and long term would seem as beneficial, which probably, I don't know if they actually would release more dopamine in terms of the total dopamine, but if I assume I stick to a healthy nutrition instead of a not healthy nutrition, then in the long term, in the mid and long term, then this would be more beneficial compared to a less healthy nutrition, for example. So the choice architecture, or the role of choice architecture now in this model in which I stand in a tunnel and I now have all of these options, would be to try to move the options that seem effortful or actually are effortful to try to get them to a neutral space or even to a down space, and to increase, on the other hand, the options that would go down, and therefore basically release dopamine with every single step, and also basically release physical energy with every single step as you go downward in gravity, compared to requiring physical energy with every single step to move them upwards. So if I think about TikTok, then I would have to, or any other social media platform or anything else that is kind of not so beneficial and also designed to be somewhat addicting, not in a clinical sense but in a common language use sense. So I would try to basically move these vectors that are not beneficial up in the mid and long term, and the other ones down.